Our second talk is by Henry Marcy from Lancaster University, who's going to be talking about using neural and statistical models for wind prediction.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, hi everyone, it's great to be here. So I'm going to be talking about significantly simpler AI models than all the fancy ones we've been talking about today. I am definitely not a climate scientist or a weather forecaster or anything like this. And this project came about in kind of the best way. So basically these guys from Météo Suisse contacted me to complain that some of the code that I produced and released online didn't work properly. And then that led to an interesting collaboration, and we were sort of hacking away to try and get a particular instance of Gaussian processors and neural networks working together in quite a reliable way that we could hopefully, and then they did operationalize as part of Météo Suisse. So I'm going to be talking about sub-kilometre wind prediction. Please do kick off if you've got questions and things during. I don't think I've got 30 minutes worth of material, so yeah, feel free to do that. Actually on this major cliffhanger where I was describing where Switzerland was, we're still in the same situation. I'm going to give you a little bit more about the science for this very particular problem that I'm interested in. Hopefully you can remember me talking about it before. So I'm interested, well, Météo Suisse are interested in predicting surface level wind, so wind gusts. This is a hard problem, apparently. According to these guys, they say there's a lot of spatial and temporal variability, which I can imagine, particularly in Switzerland. And the key thing there for their problems is they want to get very, very high resolution predictions. Okay? So they want to be able to have a very, very fine grained field here. The interesting part about this problem is that they want to use very local, high-quality measurements. Okay? So imagine we have the access to kind of the usual model output. So we've got numerical weather predictors churning away in the background. So they can produce essentially as much data as we want. But let's suppose that we also have some really high-quality, local, kind of physical measurements of the system we're interested in. And for example, they could be at these sort of individual stations like this. So this project was all about how can we combine those two somewhat orthogonal types of information into a kind of an operational weather forecasting system. The other kind of key aspect to this, and this is why I was involved and I found quite exciting, is that they're interested in generating whole consistent fields here. So like many of the talks we've had today, we're interested not just in predicting what the surface wind gust will be at a very particular place in Switzerland, but we want to generate a consistent prediction across the whole of Switzerland that kind of makes sense. So we might be saying, okay, these are 6 different predictions of what we might think are happening. So we want to be able to do things a bit like this. So in terms of the data that we have, we have lots and lots of data. In the end, we kind of whittle our way down to just these following sources. So we have a numerical weather prediction model, which produces loads and loads of information, right? Loads and loads of data. It's called Cosmo. I don't know if people know this. I'm not an expert in this. We also have topographical descriptors. So these are telling us things about the topography at different parts in across Switzerland. And we have these 500 very high-quality sensors, okay, which are kind of somewhat limited, both spatially and temporally, but the data we get from them is super relevant, and we want to really, really leverage that. Okay. I'm going to write up front, because it sounds like this is where I'm going, but I'm not interested in modeling the covariance across different time steps. Okay? I'm not so interested in directly producing a temporal model here. I'm essentially interested in infilling. If I observe things happening at all of these different sensor locations, can I fill in the gaps, essentially? Future work is interested in extending this in a temporal aspect, but I won't talk about that until right at the end today. So when I approached this problem, I sort of initially thought about it like a statistician. So I was interested, I've got kind of small amounts of data, I've got some priors about what's going on. Let's think about a nice, kind of reliable, not too computationally expensive model. So I was thinking like a statistician, and I was thinking about Gaussian processes, which a few people have mentioned loosely today. I don't have time to go into the weeds of Gaussian processes, but the key idea here is that we're trying to model some underlying process. Okay, so this is the wind gust, and where we've plotted a Gaussian process onto that. Okay, so this Gaussian process is a probabilistic predictor of what's going on, and it's determined by 2 key things: a mean function that's going to kind of give us a rough idea for what we think is going to be happening across space, but also a kernel function that allows us to essentially extrapolate or interpolate between data points, and also kind of get a feel for how far away from data points we have to go before we don't really understand what's going on. So Gaussian processes, if we kind of fit them without using any data, we can simulate interesting processes that look a bit like this. Okay? This is one-dimensional. In two-dimensional, you get kind of similar-looking things. So one way we might think about this problem is just using the ground station surface measurements. Okay, so this is the 500 measurements from what's happening right now and I'm going to refer to that as D as I go through here. So you might view this as a set of data points. I've got my Y's, which are my real measurements, and my X's are the input locations according to those sensors. Just in order to kind of explain better what happens later on, I want to stress at this point that there are a handful of parameters in this model. Okay, so it's not a neural network. There's not thousands, millions, billions of parameters. There's 3 parameters, perhaps, in this model. Maybe we have one parameter, something to do with the mean function, one something to do with the kernel function, and one something to do with how much noise there is in my model. Okay. So there's a smaller number of parameters, but we do the same sort of thing. We try and kind of fine-tune these parameters so that our model matches the data. So the haters would say that well, this is exactly what the guys at Meteor Swiss said. They said, okay, we don't like Gaussian processes because everything has to be Gaussian for them to work. So that's not the case. They also don't like them because they don't handle very high-dimensional data. So that's also not the case. They didn't like this because we weren't using a numerical weather predictor, which is the case. And they don't like them because actually the sampling from these sort of models at very high resolution becomes very expensive. So I'm going to kind of tick off each one of these things over the rest of this talk and explain how you can get around this without straying too far from the Gaussian process setup. And actually this is kind of much more of a, kind of my background is a computer science approach to this problem. So we're going to try and hack in some interesting bits of neural networks and that sort of things within this framework. So this is where we were before. So we have this Gaussian process that's going to take in current ground station surface measurements and basically predict the gaps. What we're going to do now is try and make this model much more expressive, and the way we're going to do it is by, like any good computer scientist would say, we're just going to drop neural networks wherever we think we can. Okay. This feels like it might be a dangerous thing to do, and it is a dangerous thing to do, and I'll show you why that's the case in a second. But at the face of it, this is certainly a way that we could build a much more expressive model. Okay. If we allow neural networks instead of these quite simple sort of controllable parts of my model. And this is known as deep kernel learning. People may have come across this. It gets good and bad press for reasons that you'll see in a second. But let's go through exactly what this means. So the idea here would be to build a prior distribution that takes in, well, it has this mean and this kernel function. And the way I'm going to build these mean and kernel functions is by using this data. So I'm going to use my numerical weather prediction model, and I'm going to use my topological covariates, essentially. Okay? So there's no real in-situ measurements going into this part of my model here. But the idea is that I can somehow use all this kind of vast quantities of data to build a model that when I sample from it, so this is before seeing any data points, my samples look like this. Okay. So this is pretty cool. These are samples from our model, so I'll explain how we get there in a second. But this is, these are much more complicated, high-structured samples than we're getting from standard GPs. Okay. So this is kind of the expressive power we can get by doing this deep kernel learning approach. I've added this in because last time I did this, people kicked off to ask, did I do any data standardization? And this is what the Meteor Swiss people did and seem to do a lot. I'm not entirely sure where this comes from, but this is something they were doing to all of their wind measurements before we were fitting Gaussian processes to them. Okay. So it's just kind of Gaussianizing things a little bit. And then once we have this simple prior, which is complicated in terms of the neural network aspect, but actually is still a simple Gaussian process prior, we can then condition on these in-situ measurements exactly like you would with a standard Gaussian process model, which is quite nice. So there's a really natural way here to combine complicated but maybe not super relevant data at the top here and very high quality but limited data at the bottom. Okay. We can't fit the Gaussian process to all of the data because it'd be too expensive, so we've made this kind of clear cut sort of separation between our data sources. So let's just pull apart what exactly is going on. So I said what I'm going to do is drop neural networks into my Gaussian process. So that corresponds to having a neural network as my mean function, but also a neural network as my kernel function. So we think about the mean function first. Okay, so this is how we got this to work. We had a neural network in our mean function, essentially. And the way that actually worked is that we used the numerical weather prediction model as our kind of base value for any mean function. And then we learned a very small neural network that adapted it, essentially. So you can think of this as a bias correction sort of term here. So I'll say that one more time. So we're trying to predict kind of what's happening before we see any of our nice high-quality data. And what we're doing is, okay, let's just use what the numerical weather prediction model thinks is going to happen. But then I'm also able to learn some sort of bias correction. Okay? And we have a very simple neural network to do this. Kind of weirdly simple, in fact. These are the inputs that we have to our neural network at the end. The top 3 things are coming out of the numerical weather prediction model as well, and the rest of these are just kind of key bits of information about the location. The details here aren't super important. We similarly do the same thing for our kernel function. So we want to learn a very complicated covariance structure across the surface of Switzerland. And so we do something very similar. So we use a standard kernel. So, and then we use a very common construction here, which is we put neural networks inside the arguments of the kernel. Okay, so this allows us to essentially warp the space that we're trying to model so that we can force points that perhaps aren't close together in terms of their sort of latitude and longitude location to be close or further apart. Right? So imagine that you have a mountain range going through the middle of 2 points. You don't want them to be, their distance just be given by, say, kind of the Euclidean distance. So that's what's going on here. And again, we use a very simple neural network compared to all of the neural networks we've been talking about today in order to kind of learn this effect. And then these are the inputs that we use for this part of the kernel. Okay, so it's a slightly smaller list than we had before. There's nothing coming in here that's that surprising, I don't think. But these are kind of things that we can just collect. Again, the top two things here I think are coming from the numerical weather prediction model. So just to reiterate what I've said before, we have this prior, which has got the neural network aspects in here. So we're throwing kind of lots of data at this. We're throwing the numerical weather prediction data at this. And then when we're doing our Bayesian update, we're only giving in the very high quality data that we want to really spend a lot of time trying to analyzing the quality of. So I said that this might be a bad idea, and it certainly is. And there's lots of statisticians that have kicked off about this sort of method before. And there's a really nice paper called Promises and Pitfalls of Deep Kernel Learning that looks into this approach, basically. And if you recall, I said in standard GPs, what we're doing is we fit a very small number of parameters to our data. Obviously, what we're doing now is we're fitting a very large number of parameters to our data, right? We're fitting a neural network to our data in our mean function, for example. And you can get effects like this. So on the left, imagine I have some data that's generated by this nice smooth function. So a standard Gaussian process that's not too over-parameterized would learn this really nicely. Whereas if we sort of throw neural networks wherever we can, it's very easy to dramatically overfit, right? And you can get this horrible jumpy sort of behavior. And we found exactly the same thing happened when we applied it to this sort of surface wind prediction task. And the reason why this happens is that the loss function that we're using for these models, so at the top left here, this log p of y is basically just saying how likely is the data according to my model, and then we mess around with the model until we get the most likely model. You can decompose this as a complexity in a data fit term. And in this paper, they have some nice analysis where they show that actually, if you're going to make your kernel function, for example, arbitrarily complicated, you actually get into some weird pathological effects, where your data fit term essentially stagnates, your complexity term essentially stagnates, and it's not able to stop you overfitting anymore. So what we do is we use something from a slightly more recent paper, this possibly isn't the nicest way to present what we did, but I wanted to include this in here just for to make sure I was comprehensive. But essentially what we do is we say, okay, rather than trying to just fit a single model that's going to be good at all times, we say that we have to fit a model, so we have to learn the neural networks that ensure that our model is going to be good whatever time slice we're using it on. Okay, and that kind of gave us an extra part of regularization. Again, this is quite hacky, and we were keen to get something that just sort of worked well on the test data that they had. It's not a particularly principled approach, but you can imagine that this is going to stop you overfitting to some extent. Okay. So I wanted to quickly go through a couple of the results that I pulled out of the paper. So we have these reliability plots, and here we're going to play around with the different mean functions. So I've told you that this neural mean thing is important, and you can see that it is from these plots. So these plots, for example, if we look at the bottom left here, we're looking at whenever our model's predicting 10 meters per second wind, how reliable was that prediction, essentially? So we compare the predicted probability with the observed probability, so the empirical probability. And we want that to kind of go along this black line of the diagonal here. So if you look at these different things, so the constant mean would be just a constant value, which is doing very poorly in these sort of settings where we've got a lot of wind, whereas the neural mean, so that was this numerical weather prediction with the bias correction, is able to do quite a bit better, right? You see we're able to kind of steer it back onto this line by applying the bias correction. But this shouldn't be surprising to you guys. You guys love bias correction, I think. So we did the same thing for the kernel functions. So we explore the choices of using different kernels. So we have this spatial deep kernel that we thought was important. So this is this kernel that has the neural network in there. And you see that we're, again, that's in the orange here. We're able to get performances that are somewhat behaving better in these slightly more dramatic wind scenarios. Okay. We also considered another effect, which was actually combining the kernel with a linear kernel, which sounds quite straightforward, but there was some motivation behind this in terms of allowing us to have a slightly more flexible model. In practice, it didn't make an important difference. But this is the sort of situation. So we have some nice plots in this paper, which is fun. Normally, I don't get to do nice plots in the methodology work. But these are samples from the posterior. Okay. So what we've got here is we've got a particular time step. So we're interested in a particular storm event that happened. We've got our individual data points at our sensor locations. We've conditioned the model on those, and I'm sampling 6 realizations of what I think are happening across Switzerland. Okay. So you see that we get this nice sort of spatial variability across the samples. They're all somewhat consistent. You can't see where the individual locations are, but I'm telling you that they are consistent, at least those locations. And according to lots of metrics that Meteo Swiss had for their forecasts, they liked this and they thought this was nice. Okay, so we're getting these full spatial grids, which is good. I know I said we weren't interested in temporal modeling directly, but we did see what happened if we just used our model at different time steps going forwards. Okay. So at the top, this is the effect of just having the model that we trained on the Cosmo data, on the numerical weather prediction. So we're interested in trying to match this red line, which is the amount of wind at a particular location that we were trying to model. If we use just the numerical weather prediction model, that's this blue line at the top, so it dramatically over-eggs what's going on most of the time. Whereas our sort of prior model, so this is without using any of the high-quality data, does somewhat similar but has quite high uncertainty estimates. If we now condition on this very high-quality but very sparse data set that we have at each of these time points, you see that we're able to really dramatically reduce our uncertainty and quite accurately, apart from maybe over here, track what's going on. Okay, so that was nice. So this is another positive picture. Because I've wasted time faffing around getting my slides ready, I'll save the mathsy slide, I think. This isn't super important for what's going on. But one thing I wanted to mention was that we used some clever approximation methods in order to be able to run this model at a very, very high resolution. So actually getting the fields out of this model. So we're interested in doing fields at kind of 250 meter resolution. Okay, so this ended up having a ginormous number of pixels. And if you were using a standard Gaussian process, this would be a crazy thing to do. It'd be very expensive. But there's some powerful approximations you can make in order to get these sort of plots out. So this is, again, a good thing to have for these sort of operational systems. So I'm going to leave it at that. Ongoing sort of discussions and arguments are around modeling the temporal covariance. So how can we build a model that maybe has an autoregressive structure or something like this, but also extending these models to better handle kind of aspects of the data that we're interested in. So rather than just having like maximum wind gusts, can we actually model things like wind vectors directly? This sort of stuff. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, are there any questions for Henry? Yeah, at the back.
Very interesting talk. I work with Gaussian processes, and I know that sometimes there are problems when you have uncertainties in the inputs of the Gaussian process because of the formulation. And here you are sort of now putting a neural network in between, but still using sort of Gaussian process architecture. How does it cope with that? Or have you looked into this?
So you mean in terms of if the actual inputs to the GP are noisy? Yes. Yeah, I mean that is probably an issue, I guess. We have a noise model in there, but it's not modeling that sort of noise directly. We're modeling this noise, not that noise, right? And actually, if you look at the way that our kernel functions and mean functions are constructed, we are passing in numerical weather prediction outputs, right? So there could be noise in there. The data that we condition on is always this in-situ data, which we're assuming is super high quality, and the covariates for that were largely things that, like, where is it, that sort of thing. So we're not too worried about that when it comes to the kind of the inference side. But for sure, we could be learning something a bit weird in our in the neural network we use for our mean function on our covariance kernel. So yeah, we probably should consider that a bit more. I think the hope there was that things were averaging out nicely, and the way that we were doing the training. Yeah, it's not something we observed being a major issue, I think.
Yep. Thanks for the talk, Henry. I missed it on your results. Like the acid test seems here to be like how well you perform at held-out stations, and do you get means and correlations right? Which one of these is like on held out stations? And
Sure, yes,
how well
yeah.
they
So
do?
I tried to avoid some of the tedium of all this stuff, but this is a held out station, for example, this one. This is not a station that we use at training time, and it's not that close to any of the other stations. But we did do a separation like that, so we kept some of the stations separately and we tested on those. Actually, all of these, I think, are calculated on held out stations as well. We have some weird comparison in the paper, I didn't like it very much, where we also see how good the predictions would be at places just very close to stations as well, to try and get a feel for whether we were just sort of, I guess, yeah, we weren't extrapolating well.
But, and isn't the key sort of the dependency structure between the stations as well? Because I'm thinking like the
straw man here is something which doesn't have correlation uncertainty at all. It's just sort of doing naive statistical downscaling. Do your results speak to the quality of like the dependencies that you're getting in these samples?
I guess none of the kind of results we have are actually directly targeting that. That's quite a hard thing to target, I think. It's not something we gave too much thought to. Yeah, I'd be interested to learn if there is a good way to do that, I guess. But you're right, that's exactly the thing we should care about, so it's kind of stupid that we
if
do.
you've got like say a wind farm
And you want to compute the power generated from your wind farm and the
turbines are spread out spatially.
Yes.
That's the sort of thing you want. You want this to compute, and that requires you getting dependencies
right across the spatial extent of maybe a bunch of wind farms or something like that. So you could use like power generated.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I kind of motivated this as learning very complicated correlation structure over space, right? So you're right to bring that up. Yes, I think that requires more thought.
There was a question.
Can I ask about, you said you have this very kind of high resolution, accurate measurement at sparse locations. But how do you define sparse? I mean, is that really sparse? Because there's been quite some research in many engineering problems in super resolution, right? And sometimes the definition you use for sparse depends on the problem, because is it just based on absolute number or
I think,
in a density? I mean, how can you say it's really sparse?
I think for me, sparse, I mean, it means loads of different things. It's quite an overloaded term, right? But it typically means you haven't got all that you want, right? I think. And if I was like, if you said, oh, give me information about wind across Switzerland, and I came back and only told you about it on those data points, you probably wouldn't be happy, right? So I guess that's my definition, is that I don't have as much as I want, essentially.
It's a very quick follow-up question. So, have you tried sensitivity and other parametric analysis on downsampling? Reducing the number of stations you
No,
have.
not
Do
at
you
all.
even check if you have even more sparse? Oh, yeah.
No, we didn't do that, no. But that could be interesting. I mean, like, GPs are good in low data regimes. It's unclear exactly how this transitions across, I guess.
Because again, based on experience, I know that some of them might tend to be crucial in providing information to your estimator.
Yeah.
So if you have 50 of them, maybe 3 or 4 are actually crucial, and the rest is minor kind of information. Sparse, again, it depends on how you quantify that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's something we talk about later.
I think that's interesting, yeah. Especially if we are doing a really good job of learning the correlation structure, then perhaps what you're saying is true. We should be able to get away with fewer stations.
Yep.
Do you want to get the correlation structure in a way? Because wouldn't a gusting wind, you would want it to be very noisy because of this kind of surface roughness and having kind of your built environment in there. I miss your slide with your covariates. Have you got kind of like land type?
Yeah, there's stuff about gradient of the land maybe takes something like that into account, but nothing specific like you asked for. I do agree that there are aspects of this where you do not want much correlation, but there are also areas where you want loads of correlation, or at least comparatively lots of correlation. So having a very flexible model that can, extend correlation structure along valleys and not up slopes and broken up by various things is very important, and isn't something you would get if you just applied as, say, a standard GP that was saying, all points that are within a radius of so-and-so are equally correlated with my observation, right? So I guess that's the field. But yeah, for sure, I mean, there's much more complicated things you could do here.